Hi everyone, Roman Jenkins here. I've tried to record this about 8 times now. It's not gone well either any time, so I'm going to try to just rush through it. I wanted to talk about a near and dear military program, the B-36. Contrary to its naming schema, it was not started or introduced in 1936, but rather 1949. It was intended originally, back when it was conceived in 1941, to be a long-range bomber that could reach Europe from anywhere in the U.S. About a range of 6,000 miles, a top speed of 400 something miles per hour, and a flight ceiling of about 40,000 feet and a payload of 82,000 pounds. That original program kind of got reduced because at the time the technology wasn't there to do it. So they brought it down to about 300 miles per hour and about 5,000 miles one way. So with that, Convair was actually able to win the bid in 1941, but by then the entry into World War I had actually been secured on the U.S. side by the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the plan was to have these things ready for the end of the war. 1945 was the hopeful entry date into service, and they actually subverted normal procurement protocols and bought 100 of them before any prototypes flew, which was a big mistake because these things wouldn't be ready till 1949. So they completely missed the war. Now, in normal situations, they would have just canceled the program because there was no point in it, because there was no need to bomb Europe or Japan from the U.S. mainland anymore. Instead, they kept it around because, interestingly enough, the B-36, with its very large bomb bay, about 82,000 pounds, which was about what the B-29 bomber, the predecessor to the B-36, weighed, was actually able to hold any of the nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal. No other plane could do this without special modifications at the time, including the B-29, which dropped the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, simply because they had to modify the planes to do it. So with that in mind, the U.S. continued to pump these things out to the order of almost 400 of them over the course of its 10-year history. So the B-36 was interesting for a couple of reasons. One was the extreme height and range it could operate at, which I've already mentioned. But the other was the way the engines were mounted. Now, the engines were nothing special or new. The PW-4360s were actually fairly common at that point because the B-29 bomber had been changed up to those because they were much more reliable than the original engines. They were radial cylinder engines, propellers, which, if you're familiar with propeller engines today, you've actually seen turboprops, which are turbine engines that happen to look like propeller engines. Jets are turbine engines as well, but they don't operate on the same principle as a prop engine does. So these engines were huge, 28 cylinders, 56 spark plugs in them. They're just big. They take about 4,000 horsepower or something like that by the end, by their ultimate stage called Wasp Majors. So these things were big, and they needed 6 of them on the plane. And they needed to mount them in pusher configuration to actually keep the thing up, because the extra long wingspan of the plane was what enabled it to get to such high heights, which actually emulated later on in the U-2 program, which would help that plane get above surface-to-air missile range. So, with all that in mind, the pusher configuration was a terrible idea because they didn't actually modify the engine in any way. They just took it and decided that they would just switch it backwards, which wasn't great because it meant that they had to basically accept that parts that would normally be in hot areas were going to be in cold areas all of a sudden, which caused a lot of icing up issues and engine fires both in the air and just on the ground. So, a bad idea. But with the 6 engines, this thing still barely got into the air. So, with all that in mind, they still produced about 400 of these almost, like I said earlier. And of those 400, a bunch crashed. Some were modified again into a much more light configuration that allowed them to cut down on crew numbers. It used to be 15 when it first launched. It was 9 in the final configuration, which meant they eliminated the galley and a couple of the turrets because those were useless. They were heavily used during the Korean War campaign, which was interesting because at the same time, the U.S. Navy was making use of its carriers, similar to how it had done so in the Japanese campaign of World War II, which actually caused some consternation between the Navy and the Air Force, because the Navy wanted to build carriers and the U.S. Air Force, or the Strategic Air Command, which was part of the Air Force, wanted to build these bombers. So Convair had kind of an ace in the hole in the Secretary of Defense, Lewis Johnson, at the time, who had been a former board member. And so when the Navy came to the Congress and the Department of Defense asking for a change in payments, or a change in priorities to go for supercarriers instead of long-range bombers, Lewis Johnson shot that down and actually supported the bomber over the supercarrier program. Later on, this would be reversed, and it would be decided that both programs were of vital national interest, and so neither would actually lose or be in direct confrontation with each other anymore. But this division would not be forgotten, and years later, the Navy would actually challenge that their newest fighter programs, the Banshee, could fly above the level that the B-36 operated at and take it down, and therefore the B-36 was obsolete and useless. Lewis Johnson shot this idea down as well, which makes it a very interesting case of the military-industrial complex, even before Ike Eisenhower called it out in his farewell address. So, with all this in mind, what actually killed the B-36 program years and years later, in about the late 1950s, was the development of fighters that were proven to go above 40,000 feet, like the MiG, which was operating at about 50,000. ICBMs becoming more readily accessible and reliable, which happened in the late 50s, and which led to the creation of the National Highway System, actually. So, thank your local defense contractor, I guess. And the really the lessening need of a long-range nuclear bomber. While we don't think it at the time, we were pretty much looking at, why would we need to bomb other continents when we can drop missiles across these continents, when the radar profiles are so bad, when it's so big and so heavy to operate? Why would we need this thing? But what was really the end of this program was the B-52 bomber, which was in operation even as late as 2005. So the B-36 died in 1959, and no one will miss it. Thanks for listening. I hope everyone learned something today.